Tired of all those pesky laws getting in the way of the utopia that's just around the corner? Well, so is Louis Michael Seidman. He's the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Constitutional Law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. Writing an op-ed piece for a small, out-of-the-way, barely read newspaper, he argues that government is broken, and the reason government is broken is because of our outdated, slavish submission to an out-of-date piece of yellowed parchment. Well, joining me now to celebrate the new dawn of a post-Constitution future are Steve Green and Scott Ott. Gents, there's a diamond mine of glistening wisdom in Mr. Seidman's missive, but the thrust of it can be garnered in this paragraph. As someone who's taught constitutional law for almost 40 years, I'm ashamed it took me so long to realize how bizarre all this is. Imagine that after a careful study, a government official, say, the president of one of the party leaders of Congress, reaches a considered judgment that a particular course of action is best for the country. Suddenly, someone bursts into the room with new information. A group of white, propertied men who've been dead for 2 centuries, know nothing about our present situation, acted illegally under existing law, and thought it was fine to own slaves while they might have disagreed with this course of action. Is it even remotely rational that this official should change his or her mind because of this divination? Scott, your remarkable Freedom's Charter show here at PJTV kind of makes you uniquely qualified to weigh in on these awesome new improvements to the post-constitutional America. Presumably, using the example above, Mr. Seidman assumes that spending measures will be appropriated by whom? The God King that's been vouchsafed to us by an ever-loving providence?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, what I was thinking as you were describing this was that, Mr. Seidman or Professor Seidman and I should just go out and have a beer because we really have nothing to do. I make a TV show about the Constitution, and that's just going to go be a museum piece or something. And for 40 years, he's been teaching about this worthless piece of paper that really shouldn't exist. So I think he should not only tender his resignation, but he should refund to the universities that for which he's worked all of the money that they've paid him to teach about this thing. I mean, essentially, he's been teaching about an utter fiction. This is like a guy, I mean, you've got to read the piece to fully appreciate this, but this is like a guy who goes through the history of the automobile and points out all the times where the spark plugs have fouled and, the wheels didn't turn right or a tire blew or the thing crashed or the engine broke down. And because of that, man needs to utterly abandon the idea of motorized travel.
Yeah, that's right. Guys like Seidman study the Constitution the same way that Nimitz studied the Japanese fleet, as a means to figure out how best to destroy it. Steve, just going along with what Scott just said, constitutional scholar Seidman then goes on to make his case by pointing out 3 cases where politicians have essentially disregarded the Constitution, ending with the fatuous, and the list goes on and on. So he lists 3 examples of politicians ignoring the Constitution against what? Against hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of times that they didn't ignore it, that they were actually limited by it, and the result of which was the most prosperous and powerful nation in the history of the world?
Yeah, and of course, the times that the Constitution has been ignored, it's been a disaster, especially the last 100 years of creeping statism. But I think you're missing something here. I know subtlety isn't exactly my specialty around here, but there's a bigger issue than what you brought up in your question. Like, if men were perfect, if we didn't make mistakes, never trampled on other people's liberties, we wouldn't need a Constitution.
That's right.
But we have a Constitution precisely because people, even well-intentioned people, can do really stupid, dangerous things and damage people's liberties. Our Constitution is rigged to make it more difficult for those things to happen, but it's not possible to stop it completely. What Seidman wants is to make it easier, far easier, for would-be tyrants to do what they want to do, and he knows it because at heart, this man is a filthy, tiny little tyrant.
But he's acting in the best interest, Steve. He's acting in people's best interest. They always are, aren't they? Now, lads, you'll be pleased to know that this great constitutional expert isn't for abandoning all of the Constitution, just the parts he finds troublesome, like spending limits and, no doubt, that Second Amendment that apparently allows muskets to exist in computer labs. He does go on to say, quote, "This is not to say that we should disobey all constitutional commands. Freedom of speech and religion, equal protection of the law, and protections against governmental deprivation of life, liberty, and property are important, whether they're in the Constitution or not. We should continue to follow those requirements out of respect, not out of obligation." So in other words, guys, we'll keep the parts of the Constitution, that protect me out of respect, not out of obligation. Now, Scotty, I think that's a noble goal. I say we apply that same standard to murder. Not make it illegal per se, but as a general guideline that we follow out of respect, not out of obligation.
Yeah, and I think that should only apply to me. Like, nobody should murder me. But as far as anybody else is concerned, really, I don't think there's any universal standard for that kind of thing. But I just know, I happen to know what's right for me. Well, I actually like the fact that this guy sort of, without probably realizing it, endorses the idea that our rights are pre-existent. They come before the Constitution. And so they are common sense because they are God-given rights. They are natural rights that adhere to us by the very essence of our existence. And I'm really tired of this argument of people who trot out these old white guys, these property, wealthy slave owners, and somehow that it's their document. Well, first of all, it's not their document. It was their proposal. If they couldn't have gotten it ratified by at least 9 states, it would have gone nowhere. So it had to be ratified in the first place. Secondly, throughout the centuries since we've been living under this Constitution, every time we pass a law that is under the Constitution, people again submit to the authority of the Constitution. They endorse the Constitution. Every time we amend the Constitution without utterly upending the thing, we endorse the Constitution again. It is your Constitution. It is my Constitution. It is alive in every generation in the sense that it belongs to us. It is our tool.
Now you know why you should be watching Freedom's Charter here at PJTV. Steve, Mr. Sutton, you know what? I can't take it anymore. This chowderhead says that Great Britain and New Zealand don't have written constitutions, but they are, quote, held together by long-standing traditions, accepted modes of procedure, and engaged citizens. Yes, Steve, all you have to do is look at Great Britain today. It's indistinguishable from that nation that colonized the world and held the Nazi hordes at bay in 1940. Absolutely indistinguishable.
Yeah, gosh. I wonder what he thinks about the fact that Great Britain has now more government spy cameras per capita than any other country in the world, and is by a big margin. Or the fact that, I wonder what he thinks about the fact that gun violence has doubled in Britain since their gun grabbers disarmed all the law-abiding citizens. Or I wonder what he thinks about the fact that Britons are only, this is an important point, Britons are only ever one election away, just one election, because that's all it takes without a written constitution. They're only always one election away from tyranny.
Isn't that funny?
You know what? No, wait. I don't wonder at all. Seidman loves this stuff.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does, Steve Green. Because this miserable fascist, this totalitarian-enabling, useless idiot, closes his screed by saying this, but before abandoning our heritage of self-government, we ought to try extricating ourselves from constitutional bondage so that we can give ourselves a real chance at freedom. Now, that constitutional bondage is what allows him to make these suicidal statements, the absence of which, legal protection of rights enshrined in laws that have religious experience to those of us who actually believe in the law, the absence of those protections led to the murder of millions in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the People's Republics of China and Vietnam, and, not too ironically for you, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, who in the 30s and 40s didn't have a constitution to tie their hands either, and who nearly wiped an entire people clean off the face of the earth. They too depended on long-standing traditions and accepted modes of procedure as well. Oh, and by the way, that out-of-the-way newspaper that these deep thoughts appeared in was the New York Times. For PJTV, I'm Bill Whittle.